Please welcome Dr. Gakuin.
Can you hear me all right? Is the microphone working? Is that good enough? Is it loud enough? Yes? No? Adequate? You can hear me? Okay. Okay. Only okay. Is that any better? That's okay. Good. Yes, so mind the gap. Mind the gap. You probably know this phrase if you've been to London. Yes. On the Underground. Yes, it means be careful. There's a gap between the train and the platform, so don't fall into the gap. So that's the title of my talk, but my gaps aren't in the London Underground. The gaps are between words or between different parts of a transcription or written text. And I hope we'll be able to learn a little bit more about how these gaps might or might not work. The subtitle, Phonetic Transcription as an Obstacle to Fluency, is rather provocative to catch your attention, but we'll see hopefully what I mean by that as we move on. So, fluency. What is fluency? Well, I think we can talk in terms of fluent speaking and fluent hearing. Fluent speaking can be thought of as producing phrases, IPs if you like, without gaps, being able to get from one end of an IP to the other without inappropriate hesitations. My first teacher of phonetics and my predecessor on the summer course in English phonetics at UCL was Michael Ashby, and in the summer course he taught that there are two kinds of pause in speech, those pauses which occur at the ends of intonation patterns, which are expected and actually help the listener to process information, but pauses which occur within intonation patterns are heard as hesitations and disrupt the fluency of speech. So I picked up this idea from Michael, that fluency really is down to getting through an IP, whether it's a long IP or just a short IP. Remember, IPs can be just one word or a couple of words. Getting from one end of an IP to the other without hesitating inappropriately. I think we should think about fluent hearing as well. We always, when we're talking about pronunciation teaching, we're not just trying to help people get the right sounds to come out of their heads. We also want them to be able to process the sounds that go into their heads. And fluent hearing, I think, might be thought of as being able to understand phrases that have been produced without any gaps, which when you're beginning to learn foreign language is very difficult indeed. So focusing more specifically on the kind of problems that Japanese speakers learning and using English have, Japanese learners' disfluencies, well, these include, as far as speaking is concerned, leaving gaps, audible gaps between the words. And I think this is one of the things that people mean when they refer to choppy speech. Have you heard this word choppy? I think it's like chopping fish into pieces. So they're in pieces rather than a continuous whole. Japanese learners tend to overuse hard attack and initial vowels. That's the glottal stop being used at the onset of a vowel. And those of you who heard the talk that I gave about hard attack when I was previously in Japan know that I spoke about how it can be rather difficult sometimes to find, to make a distinction between a pause and a hard attack. Depends how long the glottal stop lasts. If it lasts long enough, you don't just hear it as a glottal stop, there's a break between the words. Inappropriate word grouping. Well, inappropriate word grouping, that has phonetic effects. They can be quite subtle, and I won't be going into too much detail about the way that we actually perceive and produce word groupings, but they certainly are audible, to do with lengthenings, triples and lengthenings. Sometimes they may be within an IP. You may have two words that don't have a pause between them, but something to do with the timing of the words makes you feel that some words are more connected to each other than others. So there's inappropriate word groupings, quite aside from hard attack and actual pauses that can be measured in milliseconds. In hearing, well, I think most people would agree that Japanese students learning English often have great difficulty in understanding speech that has been produced without any gaps between the words. So this is a big problem too. I don't want to go into too much detail about precise transcription. I may have made some mistakes, or there might be some things there that you disagree with. But here is a native speaker reading part of the Arthur the Rat story. I hope this is going to work because it's not going through the cable. But here we go.
Don Helen said to them, "No one is going to care for you if you carry on like this."
Okay. So the thing I really want you to pay attention to is the number of linking symbols. That's the IPA linking symbol, whatever linking is actually meant to mean phonetically. But this symbol here means there's no particular break or gap between the words. And listen to that again.
His Aunt Helen said to him, "No one is going to care for you if you carry on like this."
Okay, so it's not the segmental symbols I'm particularly interested in, but the degree of connection between the words. And if we compare this again, don't pay too much attention to the consonant or vowel symbols I've used, but the connectedness of the words here is very, very different. This is a Japanese student.
His Aunt Helen said to him, "No one will ever care for you if you carry on like this."
I don't think I need to play that many times. You can hear it's a lot less fluent, yes? There are breaks, there's lots of hard attack, and you can see there are a lot fewer linking marks than I've used for the native recording. So, connected speech. Having looked at what the problems are in a very brief way, how can we try and help learners with these sorts of difficulties? So using phonetics to help us in our teaching of pronunciation, what does phonetics tell us about connected speech? Well, one tradition that I'm familiar with, and many of you in the room, most of you probably are familiar with in the room, is a tradition that I'm going to call the RP tradition, or British phonetic tradition, Jones, Gimson, Wells tradition. I don't really have a better label for it than to call it the RP tradition. There are lots of books in this tradition to help learners. And if we look at these books, we tend to find, if we look at the chapter on connected speech, or the section in the book on connected speech, what tends to be explained is that when a word occurs in a sequence of words, as opposed to as a citation form, the phonemes of the dictionary form may need to be modified. Look at connected speech in any book like Practical Phonetics and Phonology, or any of the others you like that have been written in this tradition. The first thing you hear mentioned is the citation form, the dictionary form, and how those phonemes may need to be modified if the words are coming one after another, for example, connected speech transcription. Here's a recent book, brand new, by Carly Mace and the late Bev Collins, 2017. If you go to the connected speech section in this book, this is how it begins. We can see, when we quote a word in isolation, we give what is known as the citation form of the word. And this is the pronunciation recorded in dictionaries. However, words are rarely uttered in isolation, but are rather preceded and followed by other words. Preceded and followed by. Okay, that's all it says. The words preceded and followed by. We're not exactly getting into any detail about how we get from one to the other, but there's one before, there's one after, there's one in the middle. As a result, adjacent sounds influence each other across word boundaries. No exploration of what the word boundary means in phonetic terms, but it's mentioned. And this often causes changes in the phonemic structure, etc. So I didn't pick this out because it was particularly different or interesting or unusual. I picked it out because it was typical of the approach to connected speech in this tradition. And of course, we have connected speech transcriptions, and that book is there to help you do so. But there's a special book that most of you will know about, the English transcription course, which is specifically designed to teach people how to show connected speech, as opposed to the sort of isolated word transcriptions you get in a dictionary. This is going to help you explore the world of connected speech. And if you look at this book, the first time you're exposed to a connected speech transcription, the very first pages of the book, you see this one there, and the authors say, look through the transcription carefully. Here are some things to notice. Okay, telling people to look out for the things that are noticeable, remarkable, interesting, when you look for the first time at a connected speech transcription, as opposed to a text written in ordinary spelling. So what are the things they point out? No capital letters. Next one, no normal punctuation marks. There's a stress mark, that's the third point they make. Then there's this line here, which you could use for brief pauses. Obviously not using that between words. There's a star, an asterisk that's used for names. And then the final points are about, the next point is about the fact that a same word might be pronounced or transcribed differently, depending on what comes before or after it. And then the final 3 points are about discrepancies between the symbols used in the transcription and non-spelling. Sometimes the same symbol may be used to mean different things, depending on whether it's in spelling or in a transcription, or there may be some letters that are in the normal alphabet that aren't used in a transcription, vice versa. Now, those are all the points that are made in pointing out the characteristics of a connected speech transcription to the reader at the beginning of the book. And my point is there isn't any particular reference to the spaces. The spaces are there. There's no reference made. You might say, well, the spaces are the same as in the normal spelling, so that's why they haven't bothered to mention it. They're only mentioning things that are different rather than things that are the same. But anyway, no mention particularly made of the spaces. Now, how should we pronounce this? If you look at that transcription, and you follow the instructions in the book, you might say something like, I saw Fred the other day. I must say he's gained a lot of weight, hasn't he? He looks so different from the last time I saw him a year ago, etc. You could read it like that, but that wouldn't be a very good way to read that transcription. The book doesn't prioritise this issue, yes? So the spaces are left there, but as for how you should interpret those spaces or not interpret them, you're not given a lot of advice. Going back to Carly Mason Collins again, here are some examples of the assimilations we get in connected speech. For example, there we've got some examples of alveolars becoming bilabials, like wet paint, a bad person, brown paper. Now, of course, I wasn't saying those the right way, but there's nothing in that section of their book to tell you that you shouldn't leave any space between the words. You shouldn't release the B in wet paint, or the B in bad, a bad person, brown paper. Now, I can't promise with all these books that I'm mentioning today that for this talk I read them all again from cover to cover, looking at them what they had to say about word linking. I looked as hard as I could to find the references, but certainly in this part of the book, it's a very good book. I recommend that you get it. It's really good. But as far as this particular thing that I'm talking about today is concerned, there's no explanation in this section, this connected speech section of this book, to tell you not to release these assimilated consonants. That you really have to connect the words together in a very intimate way in order to get the right pronunciation. Likewise, quite good is not right, it should be quite good. A bag group would not be right, and twing girls would not be right. So very little help given in terms of how you actually make these sounds as opposed to just transcribing them. More or less everybody here, I think, will know Peter Roach's book, The English Phonetics and Phonology. This is the second edition. Things will change slightly in later editions, but in the second edition, we look for linking. And what do we get in linking? Well, we're told that we sometimes link words together. Sometimes we link words together. The most familiar case of linking words together is the use of linking R. So that's where we add an extra phoneme after certain vowels before other vowels. So does that mean that that's the only kind of thing that counts as linking? I'm not sure. If you go to the end of this chapter, you get a section called Notes, Extra Notes on Problems, Further Reading. So this is the advanced stuff at the end of the chapter, going into a bit more detail, some extra facts. And here we're told, an essential part of acquiring fluency English is learning to produce connected speech without gaps between words. So this is something that we get at the end of the chapter. This is a problem and a further point to make. Don't leave gaps between the words. And this is the practical importance of linking. Again, I'm not sure whether linking here only is meant to refer to liaison or whether it's meant to refer in general to avoid leaving gaps between words. So what are the spaces in a connected speech transcription? What exactly are they meant to be? It seems to me there are two possibilities. One is that they're sort of an accident, an unfortunate necessity, a non-phonetic design flaw in alphabetic writing, something that we unfortunately have to use but is not meant to be phonetic. Or it could be that these spaces are meant to be systematic symbols with some phonetic value that represent boundaries of some kind. So just to explore these two possibilities, what about the design flaw issue? Alphabetic writing. Well, alphabetic writing is wonderful, and it's extremely economic, and this is why it's taken over the world. This is why it's so useful in typing and writing. It's an incredibly powerful, ingenious invention, because we have only 26 letters in English orthography. It's actually more than 26 if you count the upper and lowercase symbols as different ones that have to be learned and mastered. In the RP phoneme alphabet, we only have 33 distinct characters. There are more phonemes than that, but of course we reuse characters for the affricates and diphthongs. So it's a very, very small number of characters. But the problem with this is with such a small number of characters, seeing words is very difficult. Very hard to pick out the words in a running text. Yes? If you've got non-alphabetic writing, if you've got kanji, many characters, and they lead you psychologically directly to words, much easier to see the words, much easier. With this highly economic, super efficient writing system, very, very difficult to spot words. Scriptio continua is this term used for alphabetic writing without any spaces. And in classical antiquity, the Romans and the Greeks, at least in some periods, John Wells can tell us more about this, he's a classicist, I'm definitely not, would write in inscriptions, or perhaps in manuscripts of some kinds, words without any spaces between them. I think the point of this was not for speed reading. What I've read tells me that this was a sort of mnemonic for public recitation, and in fact it wasn't very long before dots started to be used to separate the words and later spaces. And if we think of a transcription, there's a transcription with all the spaces between the words taken away. Now, of course, we've got some wonderful phoneticians in the room, some wonderful phoneticians of English in the room. Some of you are probably doing a reasonably good job, or a very good job, of working out what that means, and how you would say it, where the word boundaries are. But I'm going to make a guess that there are some people in the room who would not like me to pick them out right now. I'm going to guess that there are some people here who wouldn't like to be asked by me right now to tell me where all the words are in this transcription. Because it's quite tricky. We can see this one, family, because it's got spaces on either side of it. That's pretty easy. But some of the others are a lot harder to see. And even if you're doing a good job of picking out the words, it takes a lot more effort. It's a lot more difficult to deal with alphabetic writing, normal spelling, or phonetic transcription if the words are left out. Jack Windsor Lewis, in his blog, this number I haven't written the reference, it's archive 48 if you're interested. Jack said at one point in response to a question, it hardly matters whether for Prime Minister one writes Prime Minister without a space or Prime Space Minister. It's simply customarily convenient to follow the spacings used in traditional orthography. And I think this word convenient is a reference to what I've been calling a design flaw. It's convenient because it would be very inconvenient to leave the spaces out. Yes? So that's Jack's point of view. Because it would be so difficult to find the words if we let the spaces out, we put them in. So aside from the eccentric Wells syllabification system used in his Longman pronunciation dictionary, spaces have hardly any special functions in phonological transcriptions, whether phonemic or allophonic. So that leads us on nicely to the idea of spaces being used systematically. So, the Longman Pronunciation Dictionary by Professor Wells. Here we've got a systematic use of spaces, because the space there is being used as essentially equivalent to the IPA syllable boundary mark, the period or full stop mark. So some examples would be the word Japanese, transcribed as Jap space, space, knees. Running, run space in. Nitrate as nit space 8, which would be different from the transcription for night rate, night space rate. And this difference would be used to explain the allophonic differences, the fact that these sounds and these different forms, although they have the same sequence of phonemes, don't have exactly the same pronunciation, or at least in fairly careful speech, they can be easily discriminated. The spaces in LPD were also chosen to facilitate visual intelligibility. I was talking to John yesterday, and he said, in fact, that was the first motivation for considering spaces, to make these awkward, difficult things, phonetic transcriptions, easier on the eye, easier for the user to process of visual intelligibility. And so you might say that to some extent, even in LPD, the spaces are there to cope with the alphabetic design flaw. As I said, these spaces are used systematically to predict allophony, to predict the right allophones. This is from John's blog. I transcribe nitrate as nit8, while for night rate, if that were a head word, I would write a space after the T, and for the hypothetical nitrate, then there would be a space before the T. You can interpret these spaces as indicating the boundaries of morphemes, or as John chose to, of syllables. So, systematically representing differences of structure, whether seen as being phonetic or morphological. John also wrote this inside the dictionary itself. LPD uses spaces to show syllabification, but then we get the explanation in the box on connected speech and citation forms. You will probably want to omit these spaces in your transcription. That's if you're doing a connected speech transcription. So dictionary entry is run space in, but you can write running. Now, of course, these boxes, the blue boxes in the dictionary, it's not an extensive textbook. It's just meant to be brief, succinct help. But there isn't really a lot of explanation here of why you would omit them. There isn't a lot of exegesis there about the motivation. Obviously, if you want to show the allophony, if you want to make the allophony clear, you need to leave the space in, but you can write it so it can be left out. And my question here, I suppose, would be, well, I suppose then we probably don't want to omit the word spaces when we do a connected speech transcription. Yeah, so the question is, when should you leave them in, when should you leave them out? So if word spaces are systematic symbols, why is there relatively little discussion of them? And why is there relatively little agreement about them? They don't get mentioned a lot, they don't get pointed out to you at the beginning of the transcription course, and the invariant vagrant. They get left to the end of Peter Roach's chapter on linking. And we have Jack Winsor-Lewis saying they don't matter, and John Wells saying in some situations they do matter. So all a little bit vague in this tradition. But spaces can exert huge influence on learners. Space is the awesome power of the space. So here's a little script I've written, but this is from real life. I've abbreviated it slightly. This is a true interaction between myself and the client of mine who came to me and said that they definitely want to have a British accent. So I always ask people what they want, what's their goal, do they care about what particular accent they move towards, which should we use as our main reference. And this particular person says, yes, I really want to have a British accent. So in the lesson, this was just a few days ago, it was less than a week ago. So I said, okay, if you really want to have a British English accent, then you're going to have to learn to get the linking R's right. So please, can you please say car without an R on the end? Car. And the student said car. Very successfully. Good. Now we pronounce the R if a vowel follows immediately. For example, my car isn't working. My car isn't working. And the client, the student said, my car isn't working. My car isn't working. And then you're making a break there. You're actually making a little break and catching your throat. After you've made the R and before you make the I of isn't, you're making a little break there. We wouldn't do that in the sort of accent that you want to acquire. So try and see if you can go directly from the R into the I. My car isn't working. My car isn't working. This is on Skype, by the way, where I'm typing what the student should be saying as well as talking to her. Right, okay, next attempt. Okay, imagine there's no space between the R and the I. Just imagine it's all just written as one word. My car isn't working. My car isn't working. And this has happened to me hundreds, possibly thousands of times in my lessons, and I teach people exactly this. It went on a lot longer than this. This is an abbreviated version of the script. And what usually happens is I reach a point where I sigh and I say, oh, just read this. And I write it out without the space. And immediately my car isn't working. Take the space away, please. It's just happened hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. Saying imagine it without the space doesn't work for most people. Yes, but just show it to them without the space, bang. And you get continuous speech. So this is not a particularly unusual client, it happens constantly. Would anybody like to guess what the first language of the student was? No, it wasn't Japanese, no, it was a European language. No, that was a very good guess. No, French. French. The language par excellence for liaison. The French normally connect all the words very closely together like this. No, in the context of thinking about English and being careful with pronunciation, glottal stop. It's a hard attack used for the word space. This was a French client. The space can exert huge power even over speakers of languages that normally don't add glottal stops before word initial vowels. What about the influence of spaces on Japanese learners? So I made some recordings with the help of my wonderful colleagues, Asaki and Yusuke and Daisuke and Toyomi Takahashi from Tokyo, of some words transcribed using more of an American, using American vowels rather than British vowels, because I think that's what you tend to find in the little electronic dictionaries that Japanese students often carry around with them. But using the kind of spaces you get to show syllable boundaries in the long pronunciation dictionary. And the instructions given to the students with each of these transcriptions was a word. So could you please read these words? Each one is a word. And you can just listen to some of the results. Okay.
Clear out. More on. That's it. School with. Sec as and. Is and.
So we've got some breaks there induced by the space. Now they weren't provided with the orthography. Okay, I didn't want them to see the orthography. They were just given the transcriptions, but told that each transcription counted as a word. Now I've cherry-picked the data here. This didn't happen every single time. But 6 out of the 10 recordings I got, 6 out of the 10 speakers used the sort of hard attack most of the time when the spaces occurred before vowels. The other 4 speakers, the ones who didn't use the hard attack, incidentally, were the hardest ones to understand. It wasn't the case that leaving out the spaces made them sound more natural or more native. They tended to give a rather garbled and quick interpretation of the whole word. So it was in fact the better students who gave these pronunciations. Very careful, very impressive in a way, because they're interpreting the space, but not interpreting the space in a native kind of way. So the space is very, very powerful things. What about Japanese writing? This slide here is very conjectural on my part. It's just an idea I've had. I've mentioned it to various people. Some people think it's a nice idea, some people think it's ridiculous. I'm completely wrong. But the fact is that Japanese writing generally does not put spaces between words. Spaces are associated with major boundaries in Japanese writing. And my guess, my hunch, I could be completely wrong, is that this is the kind of writing that comes first in the mind of the Japanese speaker. That the Roman writing largely is a secondary thing that's converted from this kind of writing. So if I'm right, or if this idea has any value, it seems to me that it's possible that spaces are associated in the minds of Japanese speakers with major boundaries, and then when confronted with English alphabetic writing, whether it's orthography like this or possibly phonetic transcription, the spaces are over-interpreted as relatively major boundaries. I don't know whether you think there's any value in this. It's very difficult to know how you test it, but it seems to me it could be that the fact that Japanese normal writing, the first writing system for Japanese speakers, is continual as opposed to broken with spaces and alphabetic writing, leads to an association of spaces. In other words, a Japanese speaker may be shown something like that in English, but in a sense what they actually see is a little bit more like that. It's a little bit more like major boundaries. And of course, the moment I, as an English native speaker, see something like that with commas used instead of spaces, my instinct is immediately to think of it as being pronounced as we heard it before, like this.
His aunt had said to him, "No one will ever care for you if you carry on like this."
Seems to me quite a good representation. So it may be the case that spaces are being over-interpreted by Japanese speakers on the basis of the continuous writing system that they're more familiar with. Okay, so far I said, well, how can phonetics help us in terms of understanding connected speech? And I've been speaking so far entirely about what I've called the RP tradition. It may not be a very good label, but within that tradition we sort of start with, our basic thing that we start with is the phoneme inventory. Dictionaries are very important. Dictionaries which have words listed in phonemic transcription. Dictionaries, of course, giving us citation forms, and this is kind of where this tradition starts, it seems to me. Now, from this, we can then move towards connected speech forms by learning the connected speech processes in some of the books I've mentioned. They will tell us how to modify the phonemic transcription, and then our knowledge of phonetics will help us to find the right allophones for each of these phonemes that are in phonemic transcription. And from this, ultimately, for every one of those allophones, we can move to some notion of what the articulators do. And the articulatory description, if you go as far as parametric diagrams or descriptions of the actions of the vocal organs in the utterance of a particular phrase, as we get in certain phonetic examinations in this tradition, that will eventually get you to an understanding of the continuity of speech. So we sort of start with words and phonemes and we work towards the distant possible goal of connected speech, but it's something quite far off. And we might think of this as a mind-to-mouth approach. And this is really essentially the Chomskyan view of phonetics and phonology, phonetics-phonology interface. You start with a lexicon, you start with your dictionary representations, you have a derivation, applying processes. Somewhere out there, it starts turning into phonetics, and then you get the messy stuff at the end. There's a very lot of people in phonetics and phonology taking this sort of perspective. But it actually isn't the only one that you can have. And my thinking about this topic for this talk led me to think about juncture, and if you start using the word juncture, then that usually will, if you study the history of phonology, make you think of the American structuralists and Neo-Bloomfieldians, who had a very, very different point of view. Rulon Wells, a major figure in this period of American linguistic history, said phonemics takes the point of view of the hearer This was very much the American structuralist point of view, the idea of trying to handle the stream of speech, trying to analyze real speech. How do we analyze it? How do we break it down? So the perspective here, from a sort of philosophical point of view, was to think about the starting point being the sequence of phones. The belief was that the physical reality of speech, even though we have continuously moving vocal organs and continuously varying acoustic signals, nonetheless, the American structuralists were quite sure that you could break this down into a series of phones, a series of discrete bits of sound, allophones, we might call them. There was a great shock to them when the spectrograph was invented and they started looking at spectrograms because they were expecting to find the phones and couldn't find them. So they'd only redoubled their efforts to try and work out how this was going on. From the sequence of phones, each phone should lead you directly to one and only one phoneme. And again, if you've studied the history of phonology, then you know about biuniqueness. Biuniqueness means you get from one of these pieces in this continuous speech stream to a phoneme. And then part of that will be the boundary effects that you hear, the effects in that sequence of phones which will lead you to reconstruct juncture phonemes. And the American structuralists were famous for having major debates about a juncture phoneme. Is there such a thing as a juncture phoneme? One of these strings that actually represents the, is going to be the thing that lies behind certain effects in running speech. And once you put all your string of phonemes together, including your juncture phonemes, that's what's going to enable you to start recovering words and getting to meaning. So you've got to get all your phonemes first. Of course, the American structuralists had this doctrine of no mixing of levels, so you had to get all of your phonemes before you could start thinking about words. That was a separate world. So for them, you start with a continuous speech. From that, you have various ways to recover your string of phonemes, and eventually, in a different floor of the department store, completely different area, then you start thinking about words. So it's sort of the other way around from the approach that I was discussing before, the British RP type tradition, which had a lot in common with the early generativist tradition. And we can see effects of this, I think, in practical pronunciation text. Anne Cook's American Accent Training, now in its 3rd edition, so it's obviously a very successful textbook. So we go to chapter 11, word connections. Yes, so this is a chapter you're not going to get in one of those RP tradition books. Run your words together. You're told right at the beginning, okay? Very important. Run your words together. As mentioned in the previous chapter, in American English, words are not pronounced one by one. Usually the end of one word attaches to the beginning of the next word. Didn't get anything like this in our RP type books. Yes? Word connections. Read the following sentences. The last 2 sentences should be pronounced exactly the same, no matter how they are written. It is the sound that is important, not the spelling. The dime easier. They tell me the dime easier. They tell me that I'm easier to understand. And the last one should be read exactly the same way. They tell me that I'm easier to understand. So you see, the way that it works is this transfer of the stop consonant from the end of that onto the beginning of I'm, creating dime. Now, from the point of view, the RP phonetic tradition is, we're getting to, it's not that simple phonetically. There are details here you're leaving out. You're making it all a bit muddy and messy. But on the other hand, this way of approaching things acknowledges the connectedness of the words. Or a less well-known book that I found in a shop somewhere, Hagen and Rogan's Sound Advantage, a pronunciation book. Chapter 5, linking. When a word begins with a vowel, the consonant from the word before is moved over. This is called linking. In usual speech, English has a consonant now, a CV pattern. Linking lets speakers keep this pattern. That's enough. Why am I this busy? Have a seat. It's an interesting idea. Again, people with a solid UCL type phonetic training would immediately start worrying about the phonetic detail, the mistakes that are being made. But it does acknowledge, it's very, very clear and very, very upfront about telling you how connected words are. And my question is, well, if this is not resyllabification, what is it? The textbook doesn't use the complicated word resyllabification, but that's what they're telling you to do. They're telling you to take final consonants, and if the next word begins with a vowel, you move the consonant across and think of it as beginning the next word. That's really another way of saying resyllabification. And some people would be very, very scared or very reluctant to analyse this kind of thing as resyllabification. But my question is simply, I simply want to ask, if it isn't resyllabification, what is it? Because there's something going on. I think there should be some discussion of what this connectedness is between words. John spoke yesterday about changes like an orange becoming an orange. And we might say, oh yes, well you can differentiate those in pronunciation. But in normal running speech they're going to sound very, very similar. And this change couldn't happen. And it wasn't the only one. We have an apron, etc. These changes could only happen if there was some possibility of ambiguity some of the time of these things sounding the same. And you could listen, for example, to these pronunciations. Tell me what you think of them.
Cough. Cough. Cough.
Can you hear them again?
Cough. Cough. Cough.
So we could hear an aspirated velar plosive there, and I measured them. They're all well over 60 milliseconds, those bursts, quite long lag, VOT. But I've cheated here because I said it was the word cough, and it isn't. It's the end of the word takeoff in the Oxford, Cambridge and Longman dictionaries.
Cough. Cough.
Oh.
Cough. Take off. Take off. Take off.
So we've got these aspirated plosives. Some people will say, oh, all final consonants can't be aspirated. That's not allowed. No, it's got to be very, very different. There's a reason. You've got to put a space after the curve at the end of take precisely to prevent it from being aspirated. But obviously it can be. There's the three major dictionaries with audio clips with clearly aspirated K. So it's possible to have takeoff pronounced with the cough part sounding very much like the word cough. My point here is that you've got the potential for resyllabification or the equivalent of resyllabification going on. The non-equality of word boundaries. Consistent use of spaces in connected speech transcriptions suggests that all word boundaries are of the same rank. If you've got these spaces left in your connected speech transcriptions, and it's the same space between all the words, no matter what the words are, the implication is that they phonetically have more or less the same ramifications, the same effects. But some word boundaries are phonetically relevant and many others are not. If you think about weak function words, some people don't like me using the word phonetic to describe them, but I'm going to use that word anyway. Talk about it more in a moment. So there really isn't much difference, if any, between across, indefinite article noun, across, and the word across, single word across, or attacks on income, attacks in the army, conserve, conform, terrain, to marry and tomorrow obviously don't sound exactly the same, but the beginning part the same, to marry, tomorrow, the same term. Forgiving, yes, this is forgiving away, forgiving, for sale, forsaken, market, planet. So in these cases, there are minimal phonetic differences, if any, but in a connected speech transcription, same space left between the words, not allowed to take it away. So English weak words can't stand alone. They generally require some kind of adjoining strong word. That's why I'm using this word, critic. Their weakness and their connectedness make them harder to perceive. And we know that weak words are obviously quiet and short. That tends to be thought of as the main reason that they're tricky to hear. But I would suggest that it's their connectedness as well that makes them harder to perceive. If you actually leave a gap between a weak form and the next word, it's going to be a lot harder to ignore it. Weak words, I think, in English are generally overpronounced by Japanese speakers, and they're underperceived as well. Two sides of the same coin. It's the same problem viewed from two different perspectives. They're often omitted when repetition is requested. This is again something that happens to me constantly when I'm teaching Japanese students and clients, and it never fails to take me by surprise. I don't do this to trick my students. It just it happens without my expectation. I will say something like, please say book, and what I get back is book. Happens again very often. I will say a weak form at the beginning. I'm not trying to work on weak forms. I'm trying to work on the word book. Yes, I just naturally put the indefinite article in there, a book, but I don't get it back from it. So in the same way that Japanese speakers and learners overproduce weak forms, they also underperceive them. And I think the fact that they are connected, as well as their weakness, makes them harder to understand. There's also the issue of grammar and directionality. Proclitic means connecting forwards, and most English weak forms, not all, but most English weak forms connect forwards. If the weak form comes first, and then a stronger word follows immediately after. Enclitic is the situation where the clitic connects backwards, connects to the word before it, and Japanese particles and suffix do this way. We can think of them as being enclitic to the words that they follow. So in English, and can have a weak form, it usually does when it occurs between two words, and so we have you and I. You could also say you and I, it's just completely continuous, you and I, because if you're going to make a break, it's to come after you. You and I, war and peace, pride and prejudice, black and white. But of course in Japanese, you have anata to watashi. Am I right? Yes? So that the and is attached to the first word. And Japanese learners may wrongly connect English function word backwards. I hear this a lot in Japanese speech. It strikes me as very characteristically Japanese. So we get things like
garden.
And garden. Yes? It should be, if you're going to say and strongly, and a garden, or in a garden. But there shouldn't be a break between and garden, between the definite article and the noun.
Came back and said.
Back and said. Very Japanese rhythm. Back and said, and attached to the preceding word. Another one that we heard before. Oops.
His aunt Helen said to him.
Said to him. Said to him. The two attached to said and not to him. Head directionality. So this is to do with grammar, to do with syntax. Japanese is a consistently head-final language. This is what the syntacticians will tell us. English isn't as exclusively head-initial as Japanese is head-final, but English is a very strongly head-initial language. So we can go through all these syntactic categories with the labels from this particular syntax book, a recent syntax book. So we can say that in attacks, is the head of the determiner phrase. In conserve and terrain, or heads of the tense phrase. For sale, is the head of the prepositional phrase. And in planet, plan is the head of the verb phrase. So we have the heads initial and the complements final. And this is my phonetic pamphlet, which is what I use for teaching weak forms a lot of the time. People have been to my lectures on weak forms and you'll have seen the big pamphlet there. And this is because I think if you step outside language, you can access greater rhythmic skills that speakers have. Because wherever I go around the world, everybody knows the tune associated with the pink panther. Am I right? Yes? Because we have essentially this proclitic structure with the musical notes. The dum, the first weak note, can't stand alone. It has to be attached to the following strong note, stress note. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. And this rhythm is easy to produce by anybody, whether their first language is Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, Swedish, English, German. Everybody can do it. Everyone's got that pattern. It's not the case that this rhythmic pattern is lacking in the mind of Japanese people. Yes? It's just not used by the Japanese language. Yes? So if you can set English words to this, you get the right rhythm. Attacks, 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 attacks. Conserve, 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 conserve. Because the stress is on the second note, to rain, etc. And here is a sentence, a long sentence. I got these two examples from Wikipedia. That's the English sentence with the syntactic tree analysis. He discovered that he had been changed into a monstrous verminous bug. This is a sentence from Kafka's Metamorphosis. The point being, this is the Wikipedia article gives you the same sentence in Japanese. It's just a very nice illustration of the fact that word linking is related to grammar, and more importantly, English and Japanese grammars are more or less mirror images. And because word linking is related to grammar, and the fact that grammatically these two languages are almost opposites of each other, of course there are going to be differences in how words are linked, unless one makes this particular effort to overcome the differences. And there's a question of questions. Japanese speakers frequently do not perceive English questions. I'm not sure if I've read this anywhere in the literature, it's just my personal experience. I've now had the great fortune to come to Japan many times, and one of the experiences that I have here, it seems to me, compared with my travels in other places around the world, is that when I'm in Japan, I find my questions don't get answered very much, or not as much as I'd like them to be. Of course, Japanese questions are marked finally, and English questions are marked initially, often by weak proclitics. So we get structures like ka in Japanese, but in English we get structures like yes, and this little at the beginning is something that we English speakers grow up being sensitive to. Yes, we're very sensitive to how utterances begin, because these little is there a problem? Is there a problem? We very readily hear this as a question. But Japanese speakers want to know that there's this, want to hear this spoken question mark at the end. And I find this very easy to understand when I think of writing. Because if you write an English question with a full stop on it instead of a question mark, if I look at that, are you coming to the party full stop? For me, that's just not quite a question. There's just something wrong with it. It just doesn't look like a question to me intuitively. Of course, I can see that it's got the words of a question, but it doesn't feel like one. And I think this is what English questions, to some extent, seem like to Japanese speakers. Because they just don't have that thing on the end that we want to make it feel like a question. So, grammar teaching and fluency, how are we going for time? Almost finished. My explorations into American structuralism led me to read about the audiolingual method. Is this, I'm not an expert on second language teaching and learning. Is this famous audiolingual method, the Army method, is that familiar to many of you? Some of you are nodding. Yes, I'm ashamed to say that I didn't really know much about it until I read something recently for this talk. But this was a method that was established, growing out of American structuralism, the passion for structure, the idea that language teaching was structure teaching, and the necessity to try and do basic language teaching to people in the circumstances of the 1930s and the 40s and the war situation. And this is why it came to be known in America as the Army method. And one of the main features of it is something called backward build-up. Backward build-up is something like this. The teacher says, repeat after me, post office, to the post office, going to the post office. I'm going to the post office. And you see it's building up the structures. It's building up the structures of an English grammatical tree. And what we get from our pronunciation point of view is that these proclitic heads are always produced linked to their following complements. You don't get to at the end. You don't get the followed by nothing. This method, this backward build-up method, means that when the little weak words are introduced, they're introduced connected to what follows. And so, if you're taught by this method, you're only ever exposed to the right connections. You're never going to hear these weak forms separately, because they're going to be presented connected to the words that they have to stand next to. Now, this method may not be the best method in the world for every aspect of language teaching, but as far as the issues that I'm discussing in this talk are concerned, it seems to be an interesting one. And anybody here who knows this little booklet that I wrote called Smart Speech, this is basically one of the techniques that I put forward without even knowing about backward build-up in the army method. I call it the anticipation technique. So fluency, is it an advanced or a basic matter? I'm going to just briefly sketch two extreme points of view, and I'm not taking sides. I just want you to think about them. One point of view is that learners must learn the English phoneme inventory. They must consult dictionary transcriptions. They must master minimal pair contrasts, L and R in English. They must do this. Fluency is a more advanced skill. What you must do is learn the English phoneme inventory. You must consult your pronouncing dictionary. You must get L and R and drill it and get it right. Fluency goes at the end of the book. We won't necessarily, you don't have to talk about that so much. Spaces, we don't need to talk about the spaces. There's another point of view which might go like this. Few learners of English around the world are going to learn the English phoneme inventory. Not very many learners of English, statistically, are going to learn the English phoneme inventory. Not many learners around the world, not a large percentage of English learners, are going to consult dictionary transcriptions. And I know from experience that even phonetics teachers, professional phonetics teachers, may not have real control over all the contrasts of English phonology. Yes, there may be phonetics teachers in Japan who make rote mistakes. It's possible. I'm sorry, but it is. On the other hand, fluency issues arise at the two-word level. The moment you're dealing with two successive words, there are issues, potential issues to do with fluency. Take off. To go. And fluency issues affect basic intelligibility. If somebody is expecting weak forms to have a space between them and the following strong word, then of course they're going to find it difficult to understand a question, because the question begins with, yes, no questions are going to begin with weak forms directly connected to what follows, and that makes them harder to hear. So, mind the gap. I think we should know what the word space means and what it doesn't mean. We should mind or watch out for word spaces. We should have some sense of why we're using them. We should be aware of the effects that spaces have on learners. They have big effects on learners. Very big effects on how people say things. Extremely powerful items. We should be clear about the connectedness of speech. When we talk about connected speech, well, it's all very well to talk about dialveolar assimilations and things like that. But I think when we talk about connected speech, it's my naive view that we should talk about connected speech. We should talk about how words are connected together explicitly. We should be aware that written word boundaries are not equal. We might have these equal spaces between all the words, but it doesn't mean they're all pronounced the same. Grammar definitely affects connected speech, and grammar has to be taught anyway. So if grammar has to be taught anyway, it seems to me it could be used to help build basic fluency in speaking and hearing. From two-word sequences onwards. Sorry if I've gone over time, but thank you.
Thank you very much.